Tere hommikust ja aitäh. The 21st century knowledge economy has given Estonia a moment. In the knowledge economy, opportunity follows talent rather than people following jobs. And that means that there's an opportunity to reset a playing field. Countries like Estonia that can build the right sets of talent, can build people with the right sets of skills, have an opportunity to assert new dominance, to step ahead. But the key is having the right sets of skills. I do a lot of work studying labor markets around the world. And what I've come to realize is that the DNA of the labor market, the DNA of economies, is increasingly skills. Skills define jobs. Skills express the dynamism of economies. Skills define the relationship between people and opportunity. And so what I want to do is to share with you data, some of what we've learned about which skills matter. Again, I want to go back to that idea that this is a moment to be able to build a skill base that enables Estonia to step ahead and assert global competitiveness and not just competitiveness, but leadership. The key is having the right sets of skills. So let's talk about that opportunity, because that opportunity is also a challenge. Here's what we know about skills today. From some research that we did recently together with the Boston Consulting Group, we found that the average job has seen 37% of its skills replaced just over the last 5 years. 37% sounds like a big number perhaps, but it's a number. Ask yourself whether 37% of the curriculum inside your schools, your vocational and technical training programs has changed over the last 5 years. It's very hard to keep up with a market that's moving that fast. And by the way, this may sound like this is all about technology change, but what you can see on the right is that what we're actually seeing, even jobs like a marketing assistant, over 50% of the skills are different today from what they were 5 years ago, as things like social media, data analytics, and the like have redefined the DNA of that job. Now, it would be easy to say, okay, well, look, at some level, this has always gone on. There have been new technologies that have replaced old technologies and the like, and so that's just what we're seeing here. And there's no small amount of that. But what we're actually seeing is much more profound. We're seeing jobs acquire a whole new DNA and essentially hybridizing between themselves. Let's take the example on the left here of two jobs that are both involved in working in data. Accountants on the one side, data scientists on the other side. It's actually an interesting historical comparison because just like everyone wants to be a data scientist today, accountants were the data scientists of the 19th century. Before the Industrial Revolution, you managed your firm with the gold that was in your purse. It was only when you started to have big concerns that you needed accountants. But I'm comparing them not just for the historical artifact. I'm comparing them for another reason. The skills that an accountant needs are, well, you guessed it, accounting skills. That seemed pretty obvious, right? What are the skills that a data scientist needs? Well, the obvious answer would be data skills. But it turns out when you analyze hundreds of thousands of job openings for data scientists, what are the skills that employers are looking for? Well, it turns out that they actually call for even greater intensity of programming skills like Python and the like. Yes, they need data skills, but they also need business skills because we hire data scientists to solve business problems. Think about how those three sets of skills are taught. Well, programming skills are taught in the computer science faculty, data skills by a math faculty, business skills by a business faculty. And those three typically in many contexts don't cross. And yet increasingly, that's what's going to define jobs. By the way, just to sort of keep running with this idea of data scientists for a second, if you had looked at the demand for data scientists. In some ways, this is a job that didn't exist probably about 12 years ago. If you look back, there were very few postings for data scientists, around 2010, 2011. And today, just in the United States alone, there were about 60,000 job openings for data scientists last year. Okay, well, that's a big growth. But in the same time that you went from 0 to 60,000, you went from the jobs that require intensive data analytics skills from being about 300,000 to over 1.2 million in the same period of time. Right? So there's a whole set of new skills that are going to redefine jobs. By the way, these are not just the advanced software development and data scientist kind of jobs, but they're also what we sometimes call middle skill jobs or technician jobs, the kind of jobs that require some post-secondary training, but certainly not a university degree. What's important to realize, though, is that this isn't just about adding some new skills, that ultimately, as these new technologies emerge, they change the whole DNA of a job. Here's an example of mechanical engineers and the skills that employers ask for, and they look for mechanical engineers on the left side. And then when you start to look at mechanical engineers who are working with V2I systems or working in autonomous systems, you can see each of them as a whole different set of top skills. It redefined the whole job. And so that says that our burden in creating a responsive education system and a responsive vet system that can train people up is very high. These emerging skills aren't just cut and paste. You would think, okay, well, look, here's an example of an actuary. Interestingly, actuaries, you probably don't think very much about actuaries, but they are thinking about you and when you're going to die. But the thing with actuaries is this. They're doing computational math. Machine learning does computational math at scale. So you would think that this is an occupation where we would see significant machine learning adoption. It's only just starting to happen. But you would think, okay, fine, they need to learn machine learning, we can teach them that. But the interesting thing is that when they need to acquire machine learning skills, the whole rest of their job changes. They no longer need to do a lot of the things that they were doing before, but they do need skills like Python. They need the ability to have to do much more involved work with underwriting and the like. So it says that our burden for being able to not only anticipate the emerging skills, but to understand the intersections with jobs is going to be high. Now let's think about generative AI, because that in some ways advances this even further. The key, though, as we think about generative AI, there's so much anxiety about generative AI, but most of the anxiety about generative AI is a calculus of jobs. How many people will lose their jobs? Which fields will see the most job losses and the like? And it's important to bear in mind, first of all, that that is not necessarily what we're going to see. I'm going to talk about two forms of early automation, not AI, two very similar kinds of technology that had two very different effects on the job market. One is automated check-in kiosks and phone apps that you use in the airport when you're going to check in for a flight. And the other is bankomats and cash machines. So when was the last time you spoke to anyone in an airport? You don't. You checked in on your app or in the kiosk, you got the boarding pass, you scanned it, you said thank you, you left. What we've seen, not surprisingly therefore, is a significant drop in demand for airport customer service workers. Now think about the same technology that's involved in a bankomat machine. And what we saw is that after the introduction of that technology, in fact, in the US, we call them ATMs. It stands for automated teller machine. So it's literally designed to automate the teller. The demand for tellers went up significantly in the decades that followed, starting to come back down now with phone apps. But what it says is that what happened there is that it actually changed the economics of banking. It allowed for significant expansion of banking. When things get cheaper, you often want more of them, not less. If data scientists start to cost less, effectively, not because their salaries go down, but because you need less data science to do analytics, think about all the troves of data you wish you could analyze, but which would be too cost prohibitive to do today. So we may actually see some fields see accelerated demand, not less. The real changes, though, that we really need to be able to anticipate, again, is less that calculus of jobs, how many new jobs, how many are lost, and how the jobs will change. We get to understand that, not surprisingly, by understanding the skills and how the skills will change. One of the things that we've been thinking a lot about recently is about how AI changes the learning curves of jobs. There's two competing schools of economists out there who've been developing projections about AI and thinking about this kind of issue. One says that AI will make a lot more jobs accessible. Think about all the jobs that today require specialized expertise, require domain knowledge, require knowledge of spoken language or written language, which have often require social class, education, training. And generative AI is pretty good at those, can make those jobs available. Okay, fair enough. But then think about another set of jobs. And these are jobs which require a good amount of specialized knowledge, but not just knowledge, but knowledge that has to be accrued over time. What we're seeing actually is that both of these camps of arguments are both correct, but in different places in the market. To illustrate that first one, I'll talk about people working in a contact center. Turns out that you can use all sorts of wikis and things like that, which people can consult and enable them to be more responsive to customers. On the other hand, let's think about marketing people. This morning, for those of you who had an early breakfast before you came here, it looked like a very nice breakfast out front. But when you were in your house and you were at the breakfast table, there was a carton of milk. I don't know if the same holds here in Estonia, but at least at home we would have a long essay about the cow and the beautiful meadow that it was grazing in to give you this such white and creamy milk. And I'm sure somewhere there was a marketing assistant who was very proud of that essay. She'd be prouder to know that you actually read it. ChatGPT could write that essay just fine. That doesn't mean we don't need marketing people. We need marketing people to know what kind of content is needed. We need to know what kind of people we're targeting. We need to do the data analytics around this. But the field has changed. And in that case, if you look at the skills that are needed by a junior person and the skills needed by a senior person, the skills needed by the junior person are likely to get automated away. Not so the senior one. And so that raises the question of how do we train people to start their careers not at the beginning, but to start their careers in the middle, to be ready to come to work from day one already with a high level of proficiency. And that's going to be about understanding the underlying skills and understanding how they're going to change. In fact, AI changes the skills of every job. It changes them through a process of two competing forces of automation and augmentation. You can see that play out here with the example of technical writers. But what happens when jobs change their underlying DNA is that they also change the relationships between them. And that ultimately can cause a change in the entire career map. What you're seeing here is a cluster map of jobs. Jobs are like pack animals. They travel together. Here you're seeing each cluster, each color on this map represents a different set of jobs. They're clustered based on the skill commonalities. So one might imagine that the engineering jobs are on one side of this, healthcare jobs are in another color. Now I'll go back to this idea that each job is changing its skill DNA. What it means is that the way that you normally go from job to job by building on the skills you have, by closing gaps to the next job, those transitions are also going to change because you now have a different set of skills from what you had before. And the next jobs will also have different skills. So what it means ultimately is that jobs move around. They become related to different jobs from the jobs that they used to be related to. Imagine you're a frog. Maybe someone will kiss you. And you're trying to get across a pond. And it's a stagnant pond, as most ponds are, and there's a bunch of lily pads, and you can jump across that pond as people make transitions in their careers. What we're going to see happen is, imagine a storm came in overnight, and now the lily pads move around. You can still cross the pond, but the pathways between jobs change. I want to say one more word, though, about this interrelation between what we call automation, work becoming more efficient, and augmentation, that is, people becoming better. We talk about generative AI and other forms of automation and technology having these two competing effects. They can mean fewer people in the case of automation. They can mean people being more effective in the other case. When we first started modeling these effects, we started seeing something strange. We said, wait a second, there's something wrong in our modeling because we're seeing some of the same jobs show up in both categories. Same jobs sometimes involve greater levels of automation and at the same time augmentation. There's supposed to be a tug of war between them. And we came to realize that there are in fact some skills which do both. They make you more efficient, they make you better. These will be the new power skills of a 21st century workforce. These are skills like risk management, like forecasting, like problem solving and troubleshooting, like incident analysis. And so if we can define what they are, we can make sure that we are skilled up with them transversally. When we talk about transversal skills, that's a particularly important topic because we neglect often in discussions of skills. We get very focused on applied skills, technical skills. It turns out that human skills become relatively even more important over time. In fact, when we think about foundational skills, I have this image in my head of a pyramid, and the foundation is what's at the bottom. You ever see one of those food pyramids? They've got the carbohydrates at the bottom, and the good stuff, the protein, is at the top. So you would sort of think, okay, well, there are these kind of foundational skills, the human skills and so forth that are at the bottom, but the important things are those applied skills. We've studied this, and what we found is that actually it's almost the complete opposite. The further north you go in your career, the more you step ahead, the more relative value employers place on the foundational skills. And when you think about the effects of automation, the same is true. But the way foundational skills work is changing. We're used to thinking about foundational skills as core capabilities, reading, writing, arithmetic. We're thinking about them as those skills in blue at the bottom of this chart. But what we're actually finding today, when you look across high-value jobs and say, what are the skills that cut across all of them? It's actually a broader set of fundamental skills. It's also increasingly a set of digital skills. It's also increasingly a set of business skills. That may seem curious that every person really needs a set of business skills, but think about a skill like project management. That you need that whether you're going into construction, whether you're going into technology, whether you're a nurse who increasingly has to manage care across different providers and physicians. I also just want to call out this. When people talk about AI and all of its effects, we also have this kind of thing that we hear a lot. Okay, well, no one's going to, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, everyone told us that we're all going to need to learn how to code, and now no one needs to know how to code because AI will do it for you. And actually, here's the truth of it. AI will do these things for you, but it means that more of us will do them. Think about something like Microsoft Excel. Before there was Microsoft Excel, there was, there were some specialists doing spreadsheets and the like. Now, because we have programs like that, all of us are equipped to do data analysis. All of us in the presentations that we make are making charts, are looking at data. That's something that's actually a relatively new skill to the workforce. And we're going to see the same thing play out with coding skills and the like. I want to talk about, therefore, how skills play out in developing a bulwark, in enabling us to move ahead. So if we're seeing so much change, how do we equip people with the right sets of skills? And so I want to talk about the different ways that skills work in people's jobs. First of all, we know that skills determine how well you launch. We recently looked at the kind of high-value occupations that not only give people a good starting wage when they start directly out of school, but which give them high levels of upward mobility over time. And the thing about those jobs, not surprisingly, is that they tend to be fairly skilled. That means that even when people are in high school, they need to be learning the sets of skills that will equip them to step into the labor market effectively. Skills don't only launch careers. Skills also determine whether you wind up in a high-value part of your career or in a low-value part of your career. We were talking about marketing people before, and here's an example of the skills for low-value marketing jobs and high-value marketing jobs. We know what they are. We know how to make sure that people are moving to the left side of this page, not to the right. Skills also are key to how people move up. I mentioned before that the jobs that we see as highest value are not just the jobs that have the highest pay or the greatest stability, but they're the jobs that offer the greatest upward mobility. That means that there's an ability for people to not just move up within that occupation, but often to step from occupation to occupation to occupation over time. We're looking at here on the left are the skills that it takes to move from many low-paying jobs to high-paying jobs. Again, we know what they are. We can train them. We also know that in any given occupation, there are certain skills that significantly increase the likelihood that somebody's going to be able to move up within their occupation, beyond the occupation. And so it's about knowing what those skills are, knowing how to invest in people. In fact, what we know in any given occupation, as occupations emerge, as times change, there are sets of skills that we can invest in that make our workforce worth more. Here's an example of maintenance technicians and the skills of a normal maintenance technician and the skills that a maintenance technician needs in order to be equipped to work on robotic systems. The worker gets paid more, they're a more valuable asset, and they're the kind of talent that draws in jobs. I want to talk about why it's so important to think about these, not just in the context of people's careers, but also in the context of the labor market that in which we work, in the context of our competitiveness. This is a story of Boston, Massachusetts, and its software industry. And again, it illustrates how this is a moment of reset. In the US, Boston is a leading software hub. It's one of the biggest markets in the US. It's maybe second or third to Silicon Valley. But all is not well in Boston. So the jobs have been stagnant, but what actually gives me a sense of alarm is what you're seeing here. It's hard to read. It's like going to the optician's office and they say, read line 17. Maybe a little hard to read, but what I'm talking about here is this. There are sets of skills in any occupation which are growing faster than others, which command bigger market premiums. These are what we call frontier skills. They're the most important skills in a field. They're ones that are shaping the field. And here's what we're seeing. When it comes to those frontier skills, and the percentage of their technology workforce that is possessed with them, Boston is falling behind many other cities. And so it says, look, we have to be looking at not just the occupational complexion of the Estonian economy, but how do we make sure that we're building a workforce that is continually learning and continually equipping skills. That means using skills to help people rise step by step to new jobs. And it also means thinking about skills as a form of arbitrage. Do you remember that arbitrage idea from the economics classes that you took? Buy low, sell high. Skills are a remarkable alchemy, a remarkable instrument for arbitraging in people, for arbitraging in a workforce. A graphic designer who makes 51,000 euro, who acquires a set of interaction design skills, makes 68,000 euro. Doesn't cost 17,000 euro to learn graphic design skills, right? We just arbitrage. When we teach somebody those skills, we're enabling them to buy low and sell high in themselves. So what are the instruments that work for affecting this alchemy, for executing on this kind of arbitrage? Talk about 3 strategies here. 1, knowing what talent you'll need. 2, aligning education to high-value skills. And 3, growing the pie, realizing that the skills that we have today don't necessarily need to be the skills and the talent pools that we will need tomorrow. And we can make the talent that we need. So I want to start off with this idea that we need to know the talent that we're going to need. And it starts by knowing also the economy that we have. No doubt national labor statistics give us a good occupational complexion of the economy. The key then is going a step deeper and trying to understand what are those skills and the skill composition, and how does that map against where the market is going. This is a graph of a set of skills. What you're seeing here is the size within a workforce of the local IT workforce. And you're seeing where it's invested, and you're seeing that against 2 dimensions. How fast are those skills growing, and how hard are those skills to find today? So there's some sets of skills, the ones at the top right, which are already really hard to find, and they're growing really fast. These are the kinds of skills that can be truly disruptive. We call them disruptive skills. And you can see here that there's some investment in this workforce in them, but there's a number of them which are underinvested. It says these are opportunities both to make sure that we don't fall behind, but But even more than that, these are opportunities to exert leadership if we can identify and build those skills. Overall, we want to be able to do that at a meta level. I want to show you an example of 2 automotive manufacturers and how this plays out at an individual company. And then we can look at how this plays out across a workforce, either within a firm or broadly across an economy. So we're looking here at Volkswagen and Tesla. They both hire for a lot of mechanical engineers. I'm not a mechanical engineer. I don't know the mechanical engineering field. But when I look at the Volkswagen mechanical engineer, I'm looking at project management skills, supplier selection, business planning, cost analysis. When I look at Teslas, I'm looking at simulation skills. I'm looking at modeling skills. I don't know where the ball is running in that field, but I can guess it's rolling to the right. And so what it allows us to do is to use effective benchmarks to make sure that we are not falling behind and that we are exerting leadership. This is an example here across a workforce. Be able to say, okay, how aligned are we and how aligned are the economies that we're competing with or the firms that we're competing with? There may be some places like the bottom left where we don't have very many of those frontiers but skills, but nor do our competitors. That's an opportunity to exert leadership. There may be other places where our competitors, peer nations, competitive sectors or companies, are possessed of skills that we're not. We need to be looking at this strategically and drawing that map. It's also about knowing which skills to invest in. There's certain sets of skills that we probably get right most of the time. The sets of skills that you'll tend to see in this map in the top right. These are the sets of skills that are very commonly needed in an occupation. We were talking about graphic designers before, so I wanted to stay with that example. And which are specific to the field. I have no doubt that graphic design training programs are teaching people about web design and teaching Adobe skills and all the sets of skills that we think of when we think of a graphic designer. But there are 2 sets of places where there often are gaps. One, ironically, is in the sets of skills that are needed all the time, but which aren't graphic design skills, and therefore we forget about them. Graphic designers often do, and particularly in the knowledge economy, are often doing, they're often doing project-based work. And so they need project management skills, they need budgeting skills. You'll see those at the bottom right, or you'd see them if you could read this. My apologies, it's small. But we often don't teach budgeting skills in a graphic design program. We don't teach project management in a graphic design program. And likewise, there are sets of skills that are graphic design skills, but they're right now only needed by a few graphic designers. They're rapidly emerging. And as a result, they are things that we have to be able to, it's easy to forget. A graphic designer who can work on an infographic is worth a lot more than one who can't. We can know what those things are. We can make sure that we're training to them. I want to go back to that idea of foundational skills because they build resilience in the workforce. It turns out when you look at the sets of jobs that are most data-driven, most technically enabled, they're also the ones that are most invested with human skills. They have about 3 times the demand for collaboration skills. They have 3 times the demand for creativity skills. They have double the skill demand for writing skills. The list goes on. So we have to think about our training programs as a both and. It's not, hey, let's focus on technical training. On the other hand, we can't say to our educators, to our teachers, it's okay to keep doing what you're doing because those human skills and those core capabilities are what matter most. They are what matter most. But people need both in today's economy. The other thing to bear in mind as we think about skill development programs is the importance of working incrementally, of going step by step by step. I've done some work recently studying retail workers and what happens to them over time. Turns out many of them, of course, stay in retail and wind up on a low-wage treadmill of low-wage work. We notice, though, of retail workers who manage to move up to better jobs, a few percent of them move to tech jobs. The first time I saw that, I said, okay, well, that's probably because retail is a kind of good side job. A student, for example, who might be in university, might be taking a retail job to pay their bills while they're working their way through. What we saw more often is this. Let's say I'm working at an electronics store as a retail worker. I acquire some skills, and I'm not selling the consumer electronics, I'm setting up the consumer electronics. I acquire some more skills, some more certification, and now I'm working on a help desk. I acquire some more skills, and I'm moving from the help desk to being a network support technician. You can imagine the steps from there. And so we need to make sure that we're not building a job market and a training system for Superman who can leap tall buildings in a single bound. I think that's what they used to say about him. But we're building it for humans who go step by step by step. It means that we have to have effective signals in the market as well. That means rethinking non-degree credentials. Some countries have more robust certification systems than others. We know that in a lot of places, those proxies, those certification signals aren't as robust as they could be, particularly not at a skill level. And yet, today it's increasingly possible to observe which certifications are effective, what kind of outcomes people with those certifications achieve, and to figure out where signals have currency with employers, where employers are looking at those non-degree credentials, and where employers need them, parts of the labor market where there's unmet needs and significant skill gaps in the economy. Key is also to think about how we grow the pie. It's easy when in the job market to get stuck thinking about talent as a zero-sum game. There's only a fixed amount of talent in the field. That's what we have to work with. In traditional systems that go straight from university and continue on, and people have to work in a field for years, you do in fact have a very bounded talent pool. Think about somebody becoming a chemical engineer or becoming a physician and all the years they have to study. You can't suddenly call up more physicians into the economy. But we find in most jobs, we can depend upon the adjacencies between them to be able to help us tap new sources of talent, to be able to help us find hidden talent that we haven't been thinking about in the past. Here's an example of network engineers and looking at business analysts as a source of talent for those jobs. It turns out that there's a lot of skill overlap between them. And yet it's an underexploited pathway, one that doesn't often see people transiting between it. So the key then is to be able to look at both the transitions that people make between occupations and look at the skill overlap, not just mathematically how many skills overlap, but are the most important, most scarce skills to be found elsewhere in jobs that are more available, in jobs that are more affordable. And can we therefore tap those hidden talent pools and grow the pie more ably and more quickly? I want to close on this note. I started off by talking about the moment that the 21st century human economy presents to Estonia. I want to close by talking about how we think about productivity in this 21st century economy. It's a strange way to close off talking about productivity. It seems very dry, doesn't it? Most of us, when we think about productivity, we even shudder a little bit. We're thinking about people in white lab coats and stopwatches and clipboards who are going inside factories. Productivity is a ratio. It's the ratio of the value of labor's output to the cost of its input. Do you know why we have that image of productivity? because we're always thinking about the denominator. We're always thinking about the cost of labor and how to bring it down. We're thinking about the means to be able to use lower cost labor, to be able to automate labor away. The real question is, how do we put value into the numerator? How do we make people's work worth more? Skills are the instrument for building value in human endeavor. When we can know the right ones, when we can build them up, we can be ready for great leadership in the 21st century economy and for great human potential in that economy. Thank you so much.
So, thank you, Matt. Very inspiring, and I really love this last slide. It gives the hope for the future. So, now some questions. I start with my own question. You had a table there describing the skills that are needed in Volkswagen factory and in Tesla factory.
Yes.
But what about Toyota?
Interesting questions you should ask. So Toyota's looking at a different set of skills. And again, it's very interesting. Just as jobs have a DNA, companies have a DNA. Toyota has built a lot of its internal company DNA around process management skills. So they're looking less for technical leadership and more for process leadership and quality leadership. And so when you look at what they're looking for, Volkswagen's looking at sort of cost and risk. Toyota's talking about how do we build a quality process. Tesla is building a sort of future-ready workforce.
Okay, thank you. So a question from the audience. Presenter is saying, we learned and you need, which made question, how long time presenter spent in Estonia?
I came here last night.
For example, could Estonia look at what skills are needed and emerging in world market leaders and teach these skills, or look more at what's the local market skills and emerging skills? No,
I think it's actually a really great question. So I'll tell you how I'm understanding the question, which is this, right? There's kind of two ways to think about preparing for the future. One is to ground ourselves in the sectoral composition that we have today. We look at the Estonian labor market, we say, okay, what are the skills that you need to support the industry that's here today? What are the skills that employers in Estonia are looking for? How do we make sure that we are building a system that can essentially be a supply chain to those employers by giving them the skills they're looking for? The other way to think about this is to say, how do we consider what's needed outside of Estonia? How do we think about that in terms of the sectors that Estonia is trying to build, but which may not be strong concentrations today? How do we also think about the sectors where Estonia is very present, but what are the skills that will be needed tomorrow? And one of the ways that you can anticipate that is by looking at, where's leading in that field. Let's say we want to think about the mechatronics sector. Mechatronics, if I wanted to understand what are the skills to be a mechatronics leader, I would look at what do companies need who are hiring in Singapore. And I'd say, okay, this is what is asserting leadership. How do we build that? We may not need it today, and Estonian manufacturers may not be looking for mechatronic skills today, but we can see it's coming soon. And that's actually in some ways a blessing. Look, it's hard to be Silicon Valley, right? If you want to know what are the skills you need in Silicon Valley tomorrow, you'd have to look at patent filings and you'd have to consult all sorts of expertise. But most of us don't need to be at the very, very cutting edge. What we need to be is to be able to follow quickly. And we need the systems that allow us to do that.
So we need to react quickly.
That's right.
Okay. So it's the basic idea of evolution. So the fittest or the one who adapts the quickest will survive. So, and the last question, and maybe I will also ask it in the panel discussion, but in universities, we teach lots of things. But what are the things that we should teach in our universities and what we don't do it at the moment?
So I can't speak for what we don't do, but what I can say more broadly is this. We need to make sure, first of all, that we're building the intersections between the core foundational skills and technical and applied skills. And second, we need to make sure that we are building more interrelationships than tend to exist in most universities today. We'll talk just for a minute about each of those. In terms of the intersections, and we talked about each of these a little bit before, what we know is that increasingly it's easy. We work with a lot of universities. And it's easy for those university professors to say, hey, look, this is the way I've been teaching something for a lot of years. That's not just a risk when it comes to applied skills, that they're teaching old technologies. But more, what it often says is, hey, look, remember we started off, we talked about how 37% of the skills that are needed today are different from the skills that were needed in any given job 5 years ago. And it's easy to look at that and say, you know what? It's impossible for us to catch up. It's impossible to keep up. And in some ways, that's not our responsibility. And what we found is, in fact, that it's not just the core foundational skills that typically professors say they're teaching well that are needed. Industry demands both. And particularly as people move from job to job more and more, it's, you can say, well, gee, why aren't employers training these things? Why aren't they stepping up? We do need to look at how employers play a bigger role in training. But it also, a lot of that depends on they're expecting people to stay in a job long enough for it to be worth their while to train them. So that means that people have to come job ready with both. The other thing is about this intersection of different, or this cross hybridization of different programs of study. Again, go back to that example of the data scientist. If we're training data scientists, we can't just train them in data skills. We also have to give them business skills. Do those faculties talk to each other today? Do those departmental credits in business count towards your math degree to get the data degree?
Very good. Thank you.
So enjoy this.